Longtime viewers of this show are no stranger to the disgraced, twice impeached, 4 times indicted ex-president saying the quiet parts out loud. It's basically Donald Trump's calling card. Back when he was in office, Donald Trump saying the quiet parts out loud often meant speaking in code, using dog whistles, telling the Proud Boys, for instance, to stand back and stand by, or saying there are good people on both sides after white supremacists marched through the streets of Charlottesville chanting, "Jews will not replace us." But now? Well, now Donald Trump has dispensed with the dog whistles. He's just going for it. Now, as a rule, we don't air video of Donald Trump lightly on this show, but we thought it was important that you hear this, that we all bear witness to what the ex-president and current leading Republican candidate is saying here.
We were like a rocket ship. It was like a rocket ship sent by Kim Jong-un, just like that. Who was very nice, I will tell you. He's not so fond of this administration, but he's fond of me. And we had a very good relationship. Vladimir Putin of Russia says that Biden's, and this is a quote, politically motivated persecution of his political rival is very good for Russia because it shows the rottenness of the American political system. Viktor Orban, the highly respected prime minister of Hungary, said, Trump is the man who can save the Western world.
Now, Donald Trump says a lot of crazy stuff at his rallies, and this rally over the weekend was no exception. But make no mistake, when Donald Trump uses his platform to give a big bear hug to the most ruthless dictators of the 21st century, Vladimir Putin, Kim Jong-un, Viktor Orban, it's no accident. He knows what he's doing. He didn't just name-check the world's current cast of authoritarians and villains. Nope, he also nodded to the most notorious, bloodthirsty, depraved fascist of all time, Adolf Hitler.
We got a lot of work to do. You know, when they let, I think the real number is 15, 16 million people into our country, when they do that, we got a lot of work to do. They're poisoning the blood of our country.
They're poisoning the blood of our country. He's referencing undocumented immigrants. Now, Trump bad-mouthing undocumented immigrants is also absolutely nothing new. He's been doing that since the moment he came down the escalator at Trump Tower and claimed that Mexico was sending rapists over the border. But poisoning the blood of our country, it's an important turn of phrase that is sounding alarm bells for civil rights and extremist experts for a reason. In Hitler's manifesto, Mein Kampf, there are several passages in which Hitler used the words poison and blood in conjunction in attacking people that he deemed a threat to the purity of the Aryan race. He was mostly talking about Jews at the time, claiming that, quote, great civilizations of the past died out as a result of contamination of the blood, and linking the, quote, poison which has invaded the national body to an influx of foreign blood. And if you're saying to yourself, yeah, but Donald Trump wouldn't know that Hitler wrote that, Donald Trump allegedly doesn't even like to read. Well, it's worth remembering that, as the New York Times has reported, Donald Trump has long had a Hitler fascination. His bedside table once held a copy of Hitler's speeches, a gift from a friend, which Ivana Trump, his first wife, said she had seen him occasionally leafing through. During a trip to France in 2018, Mr. Trump reportedly told his chief of staff, John Kelly, well, Hitler did a lot of good things. He also reportedly complained to Mr. Kelly that American generals weren't as loyal as Hitler's generals, asking Kelly, quote, why can't you be like the German generals of the Third Reich? Now, echoing Hitler's talking points, praising fascist leaders, none of this is subtle, and none of it's a joke. It's all straight out of the dictator's playbook, and it dovetails with what he's already told us that he would do in a second term, including, quote, radically reshaping the federal government by purging potentially thousands of civil servants and filling career posts with loyalists. Nearly 20 current and former Trump aides told Reuters that, quote, Donald Trump in a second term would likely install loyalists in key positions in the Pentagon, State Department, and CIA, whose primary allegiance would be to him, allowing him more freedom than in his first presidency to enact isolationist policies and whims. Quote, the result would enable Trump to make sweeping changes to the U.S. stance on issues ranging from the Ukraine war to trade with China, as well as to the federal institutions that implement and sometimes constrain foreign policy. As the saying goes, when someone tells you who they are, believe them the first time. And Donald J. Trump is putting us all on blast about who he is and what he plans to do if he's reelected in 2024. And that's where we start this hour with the former United States Senator and co-host of MSNBC's How to Win 2024 podcast, Claire McCaskill, Protect Democracy co-founder and executive director Ian Bassin, plus with me at the table, the former congressman from Florida, David Jolly, and the Princeton University professor and distinguished political scholar, Eddie Glaude. Lucky for us, all are MSNBC political analysts, and welcome to you all. Ian Bassin, let me just start with you, because there are folks, you and I talked about this a couple weeks ago, there are folks who would say nothing much has really changed with Donald Trump. He is an extremist. He's been this way for a long time. What's the difference now that he's using words that Hitler used? We're not even 100% sure that he's doing it deliberately. What is the difference now? Why is it uniquely important for Americans to understand what he's up to and what he's saying?
Well, I think there are a couple of differences, Ali. One is when he did this during his first term and started introducing concepts that were wholly foreign to the American experiment of self-government for the last 247 years. First off, he didn't really have the apparatus to fully implement them. He had people in government who were brought in from prior Republican administrations who, in many cases, did enable some of his bad acts, but in other cases stood athwart of them. We learned that, for example, his White House counsel, Don McGahn, would run interference against him trying to get the Department of Justice to prosecute his opponents, although in some cases Trump still succeeded. What's different this time is Trump has learned. And this time, he now has an entire apparatus outside of government that is preparing to fill the government ranks with loyalists who would simply carry out his wishes and are ideologically aligned to this dictator-type agenda. And that's sort of the second thing that's different, is the first time I think Trump was kind of out of right field in a way in terms of some of his anti-democratic activity. But in the last several years, an intellectual movement has begun to burgeon on the far right that is kind of filling in the gaps of Trumpism, providing an intellectual footing for it. You now have these movements on the far right that are calling for the end of the American liberal order and to replace it with something that looks much more authoritarian, even in some corners calling for an American seizure to put it in place. So now it's not just one person who's sounding different. It's a movement that seeks to replace American democracy.
Eddie, I see you nodding your head here.
Yeah, I mean, there is a sense the first time around he's a rookie. Now he's a seasoned actor. And he's mobilizing all of those forces and resources across the country in order to, in some ways, execute what is obviously and seriously an anti-democratic project. I want to say that it's not wholly foreign to the U.S. Remember, Nazi lawyers in the 1930s are actually looking to American law, anti-miscegenation law, immigration law, as examples. Mein Kampf actually quotes the American project as an exemplary project. Remember in 1939 in Madison Square Garden, there's an extraordinary Nazi rally. So part of what Trump has done, he's tapped into a long-standing illiberal tradition in the United States and is exploiting it. So we need to see the newness of it, but also see what is actually quite familiar.
Claire McCaskill, it's possible, when people say, well, did Donald Trump even read Hitler? Many of the recipients of his messages may not have read Hitler, but these things are tried and true. Phrases and behavior that is illiberal has worked around the world, as Eddie points out, historically. It's working around the world right now. This is the kind of thing that actually gins people up and gets them to support a guy like Donald Trump.
Yeah, Donald Trump is marketing grievance, and he's doing it with scary stuff. I mean, you listed some of the things, Ali. He's also said that he wanted to terminate the Constitution. Those are his words, terminate the Constitution. And this language that he used, I will never believe that he doesn't understand the reference to poisoning the blood. And yes, he was referring to illegal immigration. And yes, we do have a problem at the southern border. But when you really step back and think about this, try this on for size. He's using a phrase that immigrants are poisoning the blood of a country, and he's married to an immigrant. And he is the father of the child of an immigrant, a first-generation immigrant. So when he does that, I hope all the Americans who understand that we are a country of immigrants are as offended as they should be over him using that phrase, which brings up horrific shadows from history that are something we should never allow to be repeat again.
David Jolly, one of the things that experts on this sort of thing, including Ruth Ben-Ghiat, bring up all the time is that if this were just Donald Trump, as Ian points out, if Donald Trump were just a fringy character on the side, that would be one thing. But A, he's not a fringy character. He was the president of the United States, may well be the president of the United States again. And Ruth's point is that the Republican Party, the current Republican Party, particularly the party in the House, enables this behavior. There are lots of exit ramps. There are lots of opportunities to say that was one too far. Tearing up the Constitution was one too far. Good people on both sides was one too far. He just keeps on going, and it's not causing anybody in the House to sit there and say, this is not who we are.
A leader without a follower is just taking a walk in the woods.
Right.
Right? He has followers, whether they're sitting in the United States Congress or they're at a rally in New Hampshire. And I think we have to have a cultural conversation, rip the veneer off this entire moment. And we almost do ourselves a disservice by bringing in the policies of immigration to this.
Which are valid and worthy of a different conversation.
Sure, and his immigration policies are hard-right, xenophobic, white nationalist immigration policies, standing alone as they are. What he expressed in New Hampshire and has expressed before is a racist statement. And it either reflects racism that he harbors personally in his heart or racism that he's willing to peddle for personal and political gain. And we should use that word cautiously, right? And in fact, it's probably thrown around too often. But to suggest that immigrants poison the blood, and he went on to suggest immigrants not just from South America, which, by the way, shows a significant ignorance of the actual border crisis originating from Central America, but he said it's not just South Americans, it's Africans and it's Asians. What Donald Trump said is a racist statement, and that becomes a cultural conversation for us. Are we going to elevate somebody that espouses such racist philosophy? And what if you're another Republican right now? Lindsey Graham on the talk shows on Sunday tried to say, I don't want to worry about what he says, it's what he does. No, you have to worry about what he says. Because this is akin to a Southern governor in the civil rights era saying, no, I support segregation, because we need to protect the white nationalist origins of the country. And to allow diversity actually poisons the American spirit and poisons our American identity. So for Nikki Haley, whose parents are first-generation immigrants, for Ron DeSantis, for Lindsey Graham, for the new Speaker of the House, for Mitch McConnell, all of you, join this cultural conversation whether or not we can elevate a racist to the presidency, because Donald Trump just told us who he is.